He invited her to be humiliated, but he never imagined she would arrive like a storm he couldn't control. The first thing they heard wasn't music or laughter or the delicate clink of champagne glasses beneath the golden chandeliers. It was the distant, rhythmic thrum of rotor blades slicing through the late afternoon sky, low and deliberate, like a warning no one had asked for, but everyone suddenly felt. And inside the sprawling vineyard estate just outside Napa Valley, where white roses lined the aisle and silk drapes fluttered in the warm California breeze, conversations began to falter, heads tilting upward in subtle confusion as the sound grew louder, closer, impossible to ignore, while Daniel Brooks stood at the center of it all in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, a glass of aged whiskey in his hand, his posture relaxed, confident, the kind of man who believed he controlled every room he entered, every narrative that touched his name, and tonight was no exception. Tonight was carefully curated, meticulously designed, a wedding not just to celebrate a future, but to rewrite a past. And somewhere in that past was a woman he had invited not out of kindness, not out of closure, but as a final, polished act of quiet cruelty, a performance disguised as civility, because nothing impressed his circle more than dominance dressed as grace. And as the guests, investors, socialites, men in tailored suits, and women draped in couture, began murmuring about the unexpected noise above, Daniel allowed himself a faint, almost amused smile, lifting his glass slightly as if to dismiss the distraction, because in his mind, nothing could disrupt this evening, nothing could overshadow the narrative he had built brick by flawless brick, and certainly not her, not Evelyn Carter, the woman he had once called his wife, the woman he had long since reduced to a footnote in his carefully edited story, the woman he expected to arrive quietly, if she came at all, dressed modestly, carrying the invisible weight of everything she had lost. Because that was how he remembered her, soft-spoken, agreeable, someone who bent rather than broke, someone who disappeared when pushed far enough. And the idea of her walking into this space, into his world, into this version of himself he had constructed without her, was meant to be a final confirmation of that truth, a silent reminder to everyone watching that she had been left behind, that she had not risen, that she had not returned stronger. But as the sound above deepened, vibrating through crystal glasses and echoing faintly against the vineyard hills, something shifted, subtle at first, like a thread pulled loose from an otherwise perfect tapestry, and Daniel's eyes flicked upward, just for a second, a brief fracture in his composure. While across the estate, guests stepped closer to the open terrace, drawn by curiosity they couldn't quite mask, and somewhere beyond the line of cypress trees, the silhouette of a helicopter began to descend, its polished body catching the sunlight in sharp flashes of silver and shadow. And in that suspended moment, before anyone spoke, before anyone understood, there was a collective pause, a held breath, the kind that only comes when something unexpected is about to unfold, something that doesn't belong to the script, something that refuses to stay small. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, though he still stood there believing he had orchestrated every detail of this night, the truth was already arriving above him, cutting through the sky with precision and purpose, carrying with it a presence he had underestimated, a story he had tried to erase, and a woman who had never needed to fight for power because she had quietly become it. The helicopter did not rush its descent. It lingered just long enough to command attention, hovering above the vineyard like it belonged there, like it had every right to interrupt a carefully scripted celebration. And one by one, conversations dissolved into silence as guests drifted toward the terrace, heels clicking softly against polished stone, eyes narrowing against the late afternoon sun, while the wind from the spinning blades tugged gently at silk dresses and loosened strands of carefully styled hair. And Daniel Brooks, who had built his reputation on control, on anticipation, on never being caught off guard, found himself standing just a fraction too still, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he stepped forward, glass forgotten in his hand, because this was not part of the evening. This was not something he had approved, and yet it was happening in the center of his world, unfolding without his permission, and that alone unsettled him more than he would ever admit. While a few guests exchanged quiet speculation, their voices low but charged with curiosity, wondering which investor or high-profile guest would make such an entrance. Because in their world, spectacle was currency, and whoever arrived like this clearly intended to spend it. But then the landing skids touched down with a controlled precision just beyond the edge of the manicured lawn, the engine still humming like a restrained force, and for a brief second, nothing happened, no one stepped out. No announcement was made, only the sound of the blades slowly easing into a softer rhythm, as if the moment itself was taking a breath before revealing what came next, and Daniel's gaze locked onto the aircraft now. No longer casual, no longer dismissive, something sharper behind his eyes, something calculating, as though he were trying to solve a problem before it fully formed, because unpredictability was not something he tolerated well, not in business, not in life, and certainly not on a day designed to showcase his success. And then the door opened. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet inevitability, and the first thing anyone noticed was not wealth, not status, but stillness, a pause that seemed to stretch across the entire estate. And from that stillness, a small figure appeared. Then another, two children stepping carefully onto the grass, their movements unhurried, their presence so unexpected that it took a moment for the crowd to process what they were seeing. Identical in height, in posture, in the way they instinctively reached for each other's hands, their expressions calm, composed in a way that did not belong to children raised in chaos, but rather to those who had grown in quiet certainty. And a ripple moved through the guests, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, because this was no longer just an entrance. This was a shift, something deeper than spectacle, something personal, and Daniel felt it before he understood it. A subtle pressure in his chest, a memory stirring where he did not want it to. Because there was something about the way those children stood, something familiar in their stillness, something that did not align with the version of the past he had so carefully rewritten. And as the rotor blade slowed further, as the air settled back into place and the golden light returned to its calm, uninterrupted glow, there was only one question left unspoken among the gathered crowd, hanging in the space between expectation and realization. Because whoever stepped out next was not just arriving at a wedding, they were about to change the story entirely. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Brooks was no longer the one holding the narrative. And then she stepped out, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet precision that made the entire scene feel smaller around her, as if the world that had been so carefully arranged for this day suddenly had to adjust itself to her presence. And Evelyn Carter placed one foot onto the grass, her heels sinking just slightly into the soft earth, her posture straight, her movements unhurried, while the fading wind from the helicopter brushed lightly against the fabric of her dress, a deep, understated shade of ivory that did not compete for attention yet somehow held all of it. And for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing about her that aligned with the version they had been told, the version Daniel had allowed them to believe. The quiet, forgotten ex-wife who had faded into irrelevance, because the woman standing before them now was not fading. She was grounded, composed, her presence not loud but undeniable, and the two children moved instinctively closer to her, each taking one of her hands, their small fingers fitting into hers with a familiarity that spoke of years, not moments. And she looked down at them briefly, a soft glance, not for reassurance, but for connection, before lifting her gaze toward the estate, toward the crowd, toward the life she had once been pushed out of. And there was no anger in her eyes, no visible trace of resentment, only a stillness that felt earned, like something built slowly, carefully, far away from the noise of this place, while whispers began to ripple through the guests, subtle at first, then growing, because recognition was beginning to settle in, not just of who she was, but of what she represented in this moment. And Daniel Brooks felt it land heavier than anyone else, because he knew her in a way they did not, or at least he believed he did, and yet nothing about the woman walking toward him matched the memory he had kept, the version of Evelyn who had once stood beside him, adjusting herself to fit his world, softening her edges to accommodate his ambition. Because this Evelyn did not adjust, she did not seek approval, she did not even seem to notice the weight of the room pressing in around her. And as she approached, the sound of her heels against the stone path was steady, measured, each step closing the distance between past and present with a quiet certainty that made Daniel's confidence begin to fracture in ways too subtle for anyone else to see, but impossible for him to ignore. And the children remained close, their presence no longer just unexpected but symbolic, a visible truth that disrupted every assumption he had made. Because he had not accounted for this, had not imagined that her life had continued in ways that did not involve him, had not considered that she could build something complete, something whole, without his influence. And as Evelyn finally reached the edge of the gathering, just before stepping fully into the circle of guests who now watched her with a mix of curiosity and disbelief, she paused. Not out of uncertainty, but as if allowing the moment to settle exactly where it belonged. And in that pause, in that quiet breath between arrival and acknowledgement, the balance of the entire evening shifted, because she had not come to reclaim anything. She had not come to confront or to compete. She had simply arrived, and somehow, that was enough to change everything. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, the kind of controlled, polished reaction he had mastered over years of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. But there was something just slightly off in the timing, a fraction too delayed, a fraction too forced, as he stepped forward to meet her, slipping effortlessly back into the role he knew best, the composed host, the man who always had the upper hand. And he lifted his chin just enough to signal confidence, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something less certain, something searching, as if he were trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the memory he had carefully archived and dismissed. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried just enough volume to reach the surrounding guests, smooth and deliberate, crafted for an audience rather than for her. Evelyn, I was not sure you would actually come. And there it was, the first move, subtle but intentional. A statement designed to frame her presence as unexpected, almost intrusive, a reminder to everyone listening that this was his stage, his invitation, his narrative. And yet Evelyn did not respond immediately. She did not rush to fill the silence or match his tone. Instead, she simply met his gaze, steady and unreadable, the kind of eye contact that did not challenge but did not yield either. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted again, because Daniel was accustomed to reactions, to defensiveness, to emotion he could redirect or diminish. But there was none of that here, only a calm that felt unmovable. And after a brief moment, she offered a small nod, polite, composed, her voice soft but clear when she finally spoke. You invited me. And the simplicity of it landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it stripped away the performance, leaving only the truth he had tried to dress in elegance. And a few guests nearby exchanged glances, their curiosity sharpening into something more focused now, more attentive, as if they were beginning to realize that this encounter was not unfolding the way they had expected. And Daniel felt it, the subtle shift of attention, the way the room was no longer entirely his, and he adjusted slightly, his smile returning, a practiced curve meant to regain control. Of course, he said, gesturing lightly toward the ceremony space. I thought it would be good for closure. The word lingered, carefully chosen, implying resolution, implying that whatever had existed between them was something finished, something small enough to be wrapped neatly and set aside. But again, Evelyn did not react the way he anticipated. There was no visible discomfort, no hesitation, only that same steady presence. And the children at her sides remained quiet, their small hands still resting in hers, their eyes observing without confusion or fear, as if they belonged exactly where they stood. And Daniel's gaze flickered toward them, just for a second, long enough for the question to surface before he could suppress it, because their presence did not fit into his version of events, did not align with the ending he had written. And though he quickly redirected his attention back to Evelyn, the uncertainty had already taken root, subtle but undeniable, and the guests, sensing something beneath the surface, leaned in without moving closer, their attention drawn not by spectacle now, but by tension, the quiet kind that builds without announcement. And in the middle of it all, Evelyn remained unchanged, unaffected by the weight of expectation or the undercurrent of judgment, standing not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who no longer required it. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without making a scene, she had already disrupted everything Daniel believed he controlled. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure. And for the first time since she arrived, Evelyn felt every pair of eyes settle fully onto her, not with open hostility, not even with sympathy, but with that quiet, measured curiosity reserved for moments people do not yet understand but instinctively know they will remember. And somewhere to Daniel's right, a soft voice finally cut through the stillness, light, almost playful, but edged with something sharper beneath. "Daniel, are you not going to introduce her?" And the speaker, a woman draped in a fitted ivory gown that shimmered under the golden light, stepped closer with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, her hand resting delicately on Daniel's arm in a gesture that was meant to claim, to anchor, to remind everyone watching exactly where she stood in his presence. And Daniel turned slightly toward her, his posture shifting just enough to re-establish control, to reframe the moment, before it slipped further beyond his grasp. "Of course," he said smoothly, though the word carried a weight he had not anticipated needing. And then he gestured toward Evelyn with a casualness that felt rehearsed, almost too practiced. "This is Evelyn Carter, my former wife." And the phrase landed exactly as intended, clean, definitive, reducing years into a title that belonged firmly in the past, something concluded, something no longer relevant, and a few guests nodded subtly, as if that explanation alone was enough to restore order, to place her neatly back into a category they understood. But Evelyn did not move, did not react, did not shrink beneath the label, and instead she stood exactly where she was, her hands still gently holding those of the children beside her, her presence unchanged, unaltered by the introduction. And it was that stillness, more than anything else, that began to unsettle the room again, because she was not behaving like someone who had been defined by the past. She was not carrying the weight of that title the way Daniel expected. And the woman beside him tilted her head slightly, her smile sharpening just a fraction as her gaze moved over Evelyn, then down to the children, lingering there a second longer than politeness required. "I did not realize you had family," she said, the pause deliberate, the tone wrapped in curiosity but edged with quiet judgment, the kind that did not need to be loud to be heard. And for a brief moment, the air tightened, waiting, because this was the moment they expected. The moment where Evelyn would explain, defend, justify, where the imbalance would reveal itself again. But she did none of those things. She simply glanced down at the twins, her expression softening in a way that felt private, untouched by the room around her, before looking back up, her voice calm, steady, untouched by the subtle provocation. "I do," she said, and nothing more. No elaboration, no apology, no attempt to make it easier for anyone else to understand. And that restraint, that refusal to perform, created a shift far more powerful than any explanation could have, because it forced the room to sit with what they did not know, with the gaps in the story they had assumed was complete. And Daniel felt it more than anyone, the quiet unraveling of control, the way the narrative he had built was no longer holding together as seamlessly as it had just minutes ago. Because Evelyn was not playing the role he had assigned to her. She was not reacting on cue. She was not giving him anything he could use. And as the golden light of the late afternoon settled once more over the vineyard, soft and deceptively calm, there was a growing sense among the guests that this was no longer his moment alone, that something else had entered the story, something quieter, stronger, and far less predictable. And though no one said it out loud, though the music had not yet resumed, and the ceremony had not yet continued, there was a single thought beginning to take shape in the back of every mind watching, something simple, something undeniable, that whatever they believed they were about to witness tonight had already changed, and it was only just beginning. The music did not resume right away, as if even the hired string quartet understood that something unspoken had taken hold of the evening, something that did not fit into rehearsed melodies or carefully timed transitions. And Evelyn could feel it without looking, the subtle shift in the room, the way attention clung to her not out of spectacle anymore, but out of quiet calculation, as if everyone present was trying to reconcile the woman before them with the version of her they thought they knew. And for a brief moment, as the golden light stretched longer across the vineyard, and the air settled into a deceptive calm, her mind slipped somewhere else entirely, not backward in a dramatic rush, but in a slow, deliberate pull, like a memory she had long ago folded away but never fully discarded, and she could still see it clearly, the apartment in San Francisco, all glass and steel, every surface polished to perfection, but never warm, never lived in. The kind of place that looked impressive from the outside but felt hollow once the door closed, and Daniel standing near the window, his reflection sharp against the skyline, adjusting his cufflinks while speaking in that same measured tone he used for investors and clients, a tone that never quite softened, even when directed at her. "You have to understand, Evelyn, this is not personal," he had said, as if reducing a marriage to strategy made it easier to accept, as if detachment made it cleaner, and she remembered standing there, hands clasped too tightly in front of her, trying to find the right words, the right tone, something that would not escalate, something that would make him pause, but nothing ever did, because in his world, everything had a purpose, everything had a hierarchy, and she had slowly, quietly been moved further and further down that list until she no longer recognized her place in it, until she became something that needed to be adjusted, corrected, refined, and when she had tried to speak, to express even a fraction of what she felt, his response had always been the same. Calm, dismissive, wrapped in logic that left no room for emotion. "You are overthinking this," he would say, or sometimes, "You are too sensitive," as if her perception of reality was the problem, not the reality itself, and over time, those words had settled into her, not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, like dust collecting on something once clear, until she began to question her own instincts, her own voice, until silence felt easier than explanation, until shrinking felt safer than standing still, and the day it ended had not been loud either. There was no scene, no raised voices, just a quiet conversation over a marble countertop, a signature on paper, a final exchange of words that sounded more like a business agreement than the closing of a life they had once shared, and she had walked out with less than she entered, not just in terms of what could be measured, but in something far more difficult to define, something internal, something that took much longer to rebuild than anything material ever could, and yet standing here now, with the weight of that memory no longer pressing but simply existing, she realized how distant it felt, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer controlling. Because the woman who had stood in that apartment had believed she needed permission to exist fully, and the woman standing here now did not. And as the faint hum of conversation began to return around her, cautious, uncertain, like a room slowly waking from something it could not quite name, Evelyn adjusted her grip slightly on the twins' hands, grounding herself not in the past, but in the present, in what she had built quietly, away from all of this. And for the first time since she arrived, there was no question left in her mind about why she had come, not to confront, not to prove, but simply to stand where she once could not, and that alone was enough. It had not always been quiet, not at the beginning, because the kind of silence Evelyn learned to carry was not something a person is born with. It was something shaped over time, refined through moments that seemed small when they happened but accumulated into something heavier than she ever expected, and she could still remember the first time she noticed the shift, not in a grand betrayal or a dramatic revelation, but in something almost insignificant, a dinner party in their home where the table was set perfectly, every detail curated to reflect the life Daniel wanted the world to see, and she had spent hours preparing, choosing the right menu, the right flowers, the right music that played softly in the background, creating an atmosphere that felt effortless. Even though it had taken effort she never spoke about, and when the guests arrived, Daniel moved through the room with ease, confident, engaging, the center of attention without ever appearing to try, and for a while she stood beside him, smiling, participating, believing she was part of that presence, part of that image, until the conversation shifted, until one of his colleagues asked about a recent deal, something complex, something Evelyn had spent nights listening to him dissect, understanding more than he ever realized, and without thinking, she offered a small insight, not to interrupt, not to impress, but simply to contribute, and for a brief moment, the room had gone still, not uncomfortable, not tense, just attentive, because what she said made sense, it added something, and she remembered the way Daniel's expression changed, subtle but immediate, the way his smile tightened just enough to signal something beneath the surface, and he laughed lightly, brushing it off as if it were a harmless misunderstanding. "Evelyn has a way of simplifying things," he said, his tone smooth, almost amused, but there was a dismissal in it, a quiet correction that redirected the conversation back to him. And the room followed, because of course it did, and she had smiled, nodded, let it pass, because it seemed easier than explaining, easier than questioning why that moment felt different than it should have. And later that night, when the guests had left and the house was quiet again, she had mentioned it gently, not accusing, not confrontational, just curious, and Daniel had responded with that same calm logic he always used, explaining that perception mattered, that appearances needed to be controlled, that it was better if she stayed in the background where things were simpler, clearer, more aligned with the image he was building. And at the time, she had accepted it, not because she agreed, but because she trusted him, because she believed there was a larger picture she simply did not fully understand yet. And that was how it began, not with something that could be pointed to as wrong, but with something that slowly, steadily reshaped her place in the world he created, until speaking felt like stepping out of line, until silence felt like the safer choice, until she learned how to exist without disrupting the narrative he needed. And standing here now, years removed from that version of herself, Evelyn could see it clearly for what it was, not a single moment, not a single decision, but a pattern, a quiet erosion that had taken time to recognize and even longer to rebuild from. And as the soft murmur of the present returned around her, as glasses clinked again and distant laughter cautiously resumed, she realized that nothing about this place had truly changed. Only her understanding of it had. And this time, she was not here to fit into it. She was here as someone who no longer needed to. The turning point had not arrived with noise or revelation. It had come quietly, almost unnoticed at first, in the stillness of a morning that felt no different than any other, except that something inside Evelyn had finally stopped bending, and she remembered the light that day, soft and pale through the thin curtains of a small rented apartment miles away from the life she had once known. The kind of place that did not impress anyone but offered something far more valuable, space to think, space to exist without being observed. And she had stood there barefoot on cold hardwood floors, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands as the silence settled around her, not as emptiness, but as relief. Because for the first time in years, no one was watching, no one was measuring, no one was quietly adjusting her into something more acceptable. And it was in that silence that she began to hear herself again, not loudly, not all at once, but in fragments, small realizations that did not demand attention but refused to be ignored. And the first was simple, almost understated, that she was allowed to take up space, that her thoughts did not need to be filtered, that her presence did not need to be justified. And it felt unfamiliar at first, uncomfortable even, like stepping into a version of herself she had not fully met yet. And the days that followed were not dramatic or transformative in ways others would recognize. There were no grand declarations, no sudden reinventions, only small, deliberate choices that began to rebuild something steady beneath her, taking on work that did not carry prestige but carried meaning, conversations that were not strategic but genuine, moments that did not serve an image but served her, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight she had carried for so long began to shift, not disappearing but redistributing into something she could hold without breaking. And then there were the twins, not arriving into her life with spectacle, but with quiet certainty. Two small lives that did not ask her to be anything other than present. And in their presence, she found something she had not known she was missing, a kind of clarity that cut through everything else, because with them, there was no performance, no expectation beyond what was real. And she learned quickly that strength did not have to be loud to be unshakable, that care did not have to be perfect to be enough. And in those early months, as sleepless nights blended into slow mornings, and the world outside her small apartment continued without noticing her transformation, she built something that no one else could see but that no one could take from her either. A foundation rooted not in approval but in understanding. And when Alexander Hayes entered that space, he did not arrive like a solution or a rescue. He did not disrupt what she had created. He simply existed within it, his presence steady, his attention never demanding, the kind of man who did not need to prove his power because it was already evident in the way he moved through the world. and he never once asked her to be less or more than she was, never once corrected her voice or redirected her place. And it was that absence of pressure, that quiet respect, that allowed something else to grow. Not dependency, not obligation, but trust, built slowly, without urgency, without expectation, and standing now at the edge of a world she had once believed defined her. Evelyn understood that everything she had become had happened far from here, far from the noise and the judgment and the carefully constructed illusions, and as the vineyard air settled once again around her, warm and deceptively calm, she realized that this moment was not about proving anything to anyone watching. It was simply the point where her past and her present met, and for the first time, they no longer conflicted. The present did not wait for her memories to settle. It moved forward with a quiet insistence, as if reminding everyone that whatever had been revealed so far was only the surface of something far more deliberate. And just as the last trace of uncertainty began to settle into the crowd, a subtle shift occurred near the helicopter, one that most guests did not notice immediately, but those closest to the terrace felt it first, the way a few members of the venue staff straightened almost instinctively, their posture sharpening with a kind of unspoken recognition. And then the door, which had remained open behind Evelyn, revealed a second movement, slower this time, more measured, and a man stepped out, not with the urgency of someone seeking attention, but with the calm assurance of someone who understood he already had it. And Alexander Hayes did not need introduction in certain circles. His name carried weight long before he entered a room. But what set him apart was not just his wealth or influence. It was the way he occupied space without demanding it, the way his presence shifted the atmosphere without a single word. And as he descended the short step onto the grass, the late afternoon light caught the edge of his tailored navy suit. Clean lines, understated, nothing excessive, everything intentional. And for a moment, the room did not react outwardly, but something beneath the surface tightened, because recognition moved quickly among those who understood what they were seeing, and even those who did not know his name could sense that this was not coincidence. This was not an ordinary arrival, and Daniel saw him too, not immediately with clarity, but with that same instinct he had relied on for years, the ability to read a situation before it fully unfolded. And something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for most to notice, but enough to betray that this was no longer within the bounds of what he had anticipated, because Alexander Hayes did not attend events like this without purpose, and he certainly did not arrive unannounced. And as Alexander's gaze moved across the estate, it did not linger on the guests, it did not scan the setting, it moved directly, deliberately, until it found Evelyn, and there was no surprise in his expression, no hesitation. Only a quiet acknowledgement that felt far more significant than any display of emotion could have, and without raising his voice, without accelerating his pace, he began walking toward her, each step controlled, unhurried, closing the distance with a certainty that made the space between them feel intentional rather than incidental, and the guests, sensing something beyond their understanding, grew quieter again, their attention drawn not by spectacle now, but by the gravity of the moment. Because this was no longer just about an unexpected arrival. This was about connection, about alignment, about something that had been in motion long before this evening began, and Evelyn did not turn immediately. She did not need to, because she felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the quiet recognition of a presence she had come to know not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through steadiness. And when she finally did look toward him, it was not with surprise or relief, but with the same calm that had carried her through everything that led to this moment. And in that brief exchange of glances, something became clear to everyone watching, even if they could not fully articulate it, that whatever story they believed they were witnessing tonight had just moved into a different dimension entirely, one where control no longer belonged to the person who had orchestrated the setting, but to the one who had never needed to. The distance between them was not long, no more than a few dozen feet across the manicured lawn, yet as Alexander Hayes walked forward, it stretched into something far more significant, each step drawing a line through the carefully constructed illusion of the evening. And Daniel felt it in a way he could not immediately explain, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Because this was no longer a situation he could reframe with a sentence or redirect with a smile. This was something that existed outside his control entirely. And as Alexander approached, the subtle details began to register with those watching closely. The way a few guests instinctively straightened, the way one of the event coordinators hesitated before stepping aside, as if acknowledging a presence that did not need to announce itself, and Daniel's fiancée shifted slightly beside him, her grip on his arm tightening just enough to signal unease, though. Her expression remained carefully composed, her smile still in place but no longer effortless. And when Alexander finally reached Evelyn, he did not rush into the moment. He did not make a display of familiarity or claim attention through grand gestures. He simply stopped at her side, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, and for a brief second, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of connection. And then, in a movement so natural it felt almost understated, he placed a hand lightly at the small of her back, not possessive, not performative, but grounding, a quiet acknowledgement of presence, of partnership, of something that did not need explanation to be understood. And the twins, still holding Evelyn's hands, looked up at him with an ease that spoke of familiarity, of trust built over time rather than introduced for effect, and one of them shifted slightly closer, a small, unconscious movement that did not go unnoticed by those paying attention, because it confirmed what no one had yet said out loud, that this was not a coincidence, this was not an arrangement for appearance, this was a life, already formed, already established, and Daniel saw it all in fragments, pieces that refused to fit into the narrative he had prepared, and for the first time since the evening began, he did not speak immediately, because there was nothing he could say that would restore the balance he had lost, nothing that would return him to the center of the story. And when he finally did find his voice, it came quieter than before, less certain. Alexander, I did not realize you would be attending. And the statement, though polite, carried an undercurrent of something else, something closer to disbelief than courtesy. And Alexander's response was simple, measured, his tone even. I go where I am needed. And there was no emphasis, no edge, yet the words settled into the space between them with a weight that could not be dismissed, because they reframed everything without raising a single accusation, and the guests, sensing the shift, grew still. Once more, their attention no longer divided, no longer casual, but fully engaged in the moment unfolding before them, because this was no longer about an unexpected arrival or an awkward reunion. This was about something deeper, something that had been building quietly beyond their view. And as Evelyn stood between the man she had once been diminished by and the man who had never asked her to diminish herself at all, the contrast became undeniable, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through presence alone. And in that presence, the power of the evening had shifted completely, leaving Daniel no longer as the architect of the moment, but as someone now standing inside a story he no longer controlled. There are moments when the truth does not arrive with noise. It settles quietly into place. Undeniable not because it is announced, but because it can no longer be ignored. And as Alexander's words lingered in the air, simple and unembellished, the shift became complete, not dramatic, not explosive, but final, and the guests felt it in the way conversation stopped entirely now. Not out of curiosity, but out of recognition, because what stood before them was no longer an awkward intersection of past and present. It was a revelation of something they had not been invited to understand until this very second. And Daniel Brooks, who had built his life on anticipation, on always being one step ahead, found himself in a position he had not occupied in years, reacting instead of directing, observing instead of controlling, and his gaze moved again to the twins, this time longer, more focused, because there was no longer a way to dismiss what he was seeing as coincidence or coincidence. Dressed as convenience, their presence, their ease, the way they stood anchored between Evelyn and Alexander. It formed a picture that did not require explanation, only acknowledgement, and something in his expression tightened, not outwardly enough for most to notice, but enough to betray that the narrative he had relied on, the version of Evelyn he had carried forward as justification, as closure, was no longer holding. And beside him, his fiancée shifted again, her composure still intact but now edged with something sharper, something closer to calculation, as her eyes moved between Evelyn and Alexander, taking in the details she had not considered before, the kind that altered social standing in ways words never could. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained light, controlled, but there was an unmistakable tension beneath it. "I believe we have not been properly introduced," she said, directing her attention toward Alexander, because in her world, introductions mattered, titles mattered. Knowing where someone stood determined how the rest of the evening would unfold, and Alexander inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than submission, his voice calm, unhurried. "Alexander Hayes," he said, "nothing more, no elaboration, no need to define what was already understood by those who needed to understand it." And the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, because recognition spread not through words but through reaction. A slight intake of breath from someone near the back, a quick exchange of glances between two investors who had just recalculated the entire room, and Daniel saw it happen in real time, saw the shift in perception ripple outward, and for the first time, the event he had curated so precisely no longer reflected him as its center. It reflected something else entirely, something that had arrived without invitation, yet now defined the space more completely than anything he had arranged. And Evelyn remained still within it, not stepping forward, not claiming the moment, because she did not need to. The truth of her presence, of her life, of everything she had rebuilt beyond this place, was already visible, already understood, and as the late afternoon light softened further, casting long shadows across the vineyard, there was a quiet, collective realization settling into every corner of the gathering, that this was not a return, not in the way anyone had expected. This was not a woman stepping back into a past she had lost. This was a woman standing firmly in a present that had surpassed it. And without a single raised voice, without a single confrontation, the balance of power had shifted so completely that it left no room for denial, only acceptance. And in that acceptance, Daniel Brooks was no longer the man who had invited her to be diminished. He was simply the man who had not realized what she had become. No one applauded, no one interrupted, and yet the silence that followed carried more weight than any reaction could have, because what had just unfolded did not need validation. It simply existed, undeniable and complete, and Evelyn could feel it settle around her, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the room had shifted and would not return to what it had been before. And for a moment, she allowed herself to take it in, not the people, not the setting, but the distance between who she had once been here and who she was now. And it did not feel like victory in the way others might define it. It did not feel like triumph over someone else. It felt like something steadier, something internal, like a door that had once been closed without her consent had finally been opened by her own hand. And she turned her head slightly, her gaze passing briefly over Daniel, not lingering, not searching, simply acknowledging his presence the way one might acknowledge a place they once lived but no longer belonged to. And there was no anger in that glance, no satisfaction either, only clarity, the kind that comes when the need for resolution has already been met long before the moment arrives, and Daniel felt it. Not as a confrontation, but as an absence, because whatever he had expected from her, whether it was discomfort, defensiveness, or even a trace of the past he believed he had defined, none of it appeared. And that absence left him with nothing to respond to, nothing to reshape, and for the first time, the control he had relied on did not slip. It simply ceased to apply, and beside him, his fiancée adjusted her posture again, her smile now more restrained, her eyes more measured as she recalculated the room. But even she could not fully recover the narrative that had already moved beyond her reach, because this was no longer about introductions or impressions. It was about something far less negotiable, something already established before anyone here had realized it. And Evelyn shifted her attention back to the twins, her grip on their hands gentle but certain. And one of them looked up at her with a small, unspoken question in their eyes. Not confusion, not fear, but a quiet readiness to follow wherever she chose to go next. And she gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, a signal that did not need words. And then she turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same calm intention that had defined her arrival, and Alexander moved with her, not leading, not guiding, simply beside her. His presence aligned with hers in a way that did not demand attention, yet held it effortlessly, and together, they began to walk away from the center of the gathering, not as an escape, not as a retreat, but as a continuation, leaving behind a space that no longer defined them. And the guests watched without speaking, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what they had just witnessed. And as the distance grew, as the sound of their steps softened against the stone and the vineyard air settled once more into its golden stillness, there was a quiet understanding that spread through the room, something that did not require explanation, that what had happened here was not a scene, not a confrontation, but a correction, subtle and complete. And by the time Evelyn reached the edge of the terrace, by the time the helicopter stood waiting once more in the distance, ready to carry her back to the life she had built far beyond this place, there was only one truth left. Behind in the space she had just walked through, something simple, something final, that she had never needed to return to be seen, because she had already become impossible to overlook. The helicopter blades began to turn again, slow at first, then gathering rhythm as the air around the vineyard shifted once more. But this time no one moved to follow, no one stepped forward, because whatever had needed to be seen had already unfolded, complete and unrepeatable, and Evelyn did not look back as she walked, not because she was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing behind her that required one more glance. No unfinished words, no lingering questions, only a past that had already been understood and placed exactly where it belonged. And beside her, the twins kept pace easily, their small hands still in hers, their presence steady and grounding in a way that required no explanation, while Alexander walked at her side, his silence never empty, his presence never demanding, simply there, aligned, constant. And as they reached the edge of the terrace where the grass met the landing area, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched. Behind them, shadows that no longer felt heavy or defining, just reflections of something already moving forward. And in the distance, a few guests finally exhaled, the tension releasing not into chatter, but into a quieter, more thoughtful stillness, because what they had witnessed was not spectacle, not drama, but something far rarer, a shift that had occurred without force, without confrontation, and yet had altered the entire atmosphere of the evening. And back at the center of the vineyard, Daniel Brooks remained where he stood, his posture still composed, his expression controlled, but the certainty that had defined him earlier now replaced by something less solid, something he could not quite articulate, because for all his preparation, for all his intention to close a chapter on his own terms, he had overlooked the simplest truth, that time does not wait for permission to change people, and the version of Evelyn he had invited no longer existed in any form he could recognize or influence. And that realization did not arrive loudly, it settled slowly, like a quiet understanding that would linger long after the music resumed and the ceremony continued. And as Evelyn stepped onto the helicopter, helping the twins in before following, the movement was seamless, unhurried, as if it were just another part of a life already in motion. And when Alexander joined them, the door closed with a soft, final sound that seemed to mark the end of something far greater than their presence at this event. And as the helicopter lifted, rising steadily into the open sky, the vineyard below grew smaller, the details fading into something distant and indistinct. And Evelyn allowed herself one brief moment, not to look back, but to look forward, to feel the quiet certainty of where she was going rather than where she had been. And in that moment, there was no trace of the woman who once stood uncertain in someone else's world, only the one who had built her own. And far below, the guests would remember this not as the day she returned, but as the day they realized she never needed to, because she had already become something they could not define, could not diminish, and could not forget. And as the sky closed around the path ahead, carrying her beyond the reach of anything that had once tried to make her smaller, the truth settled into place with a quiet finality that required no words at all, that she had never come back for revenge, she had come back as proof that she no longer needed it.